In early 20th century England, the fight for women's suffrage had been going on for over 20 years. The Women's Social and Political Union, or WSPU, had been formed in 1903 and had quickly become the leading force in the fight for votes for women. Led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her two daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, the group used a variety of tactics to achieve their goal, including peaceful protests, lobbying, and civil disobedience. But it wasn't enough. The British government refused to budge. So in 1909, the WSPU began a new campaign of more radical action. Members of the group began to take part in acts of vandalism against private property, as well as more daring public demonstrations. And when all else failed, they turned to hunger strikes. By 1912, things were coming to a head. That year, more than 1,000 women were arrested for their activities. Many of them went on hunger strike in prison. It was during this time that Emmeline Pankhurst wrote a letter from behind bars that would change everything. So let's start at the beginning. When exactly did Emmeline go to jail? We'll tell you about that next. Alright, so it's May 18th, 1908, along with several hundred other members of the Women's Social and Political Union, or WSP, has just participated in a rally outside the House of Commons in London. The purpose of the demonstration was to draw attention to the fact that the government had still not addressed the issue of women's suffrage after decades of campaigning. While the rally itself was peaceful, the police responded with violence, beating several women and detaining many more. Among them was 14-year-old Emmeline's eldest daughter, and a prominent member of the WSPU, Christabel, had become involved in the suffrage movement at a young age. Attending her mother's rallies and helping to organize the group's activities, she was arrested for the first time at the age of 13 for her involvement in a demonstration and served a short sentence in Holloway prison. This experience only made her more determined to fight for women's rights, and she continued to participate in protests despite her mother's objections. On this day, she was arrested for disturbing the peace and taken into custody along with the other WSPU members. The situation inside the prison was grim. The cells were filthy and overcrowded, the food was cold, and the women were denied basic necessities such as soap and towels. They were also not allowed any reading material or writing materials, which was especially cruel given that many of the women were activists who had been arrested for peacefully exercising their right to free speech. Despite these hardships, Christabel refused to give up. She continued to protest the government's refusal to address the issue of women's suffrage, and her bravery inspired other inmates to do the same. After spending several weeks in prison, Christabel and the other WSPU members were finally released. However, their ordeal had only strengthened their resolve, and they vowed to continue fighting for women's rights. Meanwhile, Emmeline Pankhurst, Christabel's mother, was seething over her daughter's arrest. She had always been a fierce advocate for women's suffrage, and had even founded the WSPU in order to further the cause. However, she had always tried to maintain a certain decorum in their activism, avoiding confrontations with the authorities whenever possible. Christabel's arrest had put all of that into question. Emmeline felt that her daughter's actions had been reckless and dangerous, putting her own safety at risk as well as damaging the reputation of the WSPU. She had always believed that they could achieve their goals through peaceful means, and she was furious that Christabel had risked everything for a cause that they had yet to win. Despite their differences, Emmeline knew that her daughter was right. The government had shown no signs of budging on the issue of women's suffrage, and they needed to take more drastic measures if they wanted to be taken seriously. She also couldn't help but admire her daughter's courage and determination. In that moment, Emmeline realized that she needed to find a way to support Christabel and the other WSPU members who had been arrested, and that's when she decided to take action. The next day, Emmeline Pankhurst and several other members of the WSPU staged a protest outside Scotland Yard, the headquarters of the London police force. They demanded that the women who had been arrested for their involvement in the previous day's demonstration be released immediately. When the police refused, Emmeline and the others sat down and refused to move. They were arrested for obstructing the sidewalk and taken into custody. This was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, hundreds of WSPU members were arrested for various offenses, including trespassing, disorderly conduct, and obstructing the police. They were taken to different prisons throughout England, where they were subjected to harsh treatment by the prison guards. One of the worst offenders was Holloway Prison, where Christabel and several other WSPU members were sent. There, they were locked up in solitary confinement and denied basic necessities like food and clean water. Some prisoners were force-fed when they went on hunger strike, while others were beaten and tortured by the prison guards. It was during this time that Emmeline Pankhurst began to write a series of letters from behind bars that would change everything. As soon as Emmeline and the other WSPU members arrived at Holloway Prison, they were stripped of their belongings, including their shoes, coats, and even their underwear. They were then thrown into filthy, overcrowded cells, where they were forced to sleep on dirty mattresses without sheets or blankets. The toilets were broken, and the sinks were clogged with waste, making basic hygiene nearly impossible. Food was brought in once a day, but it was often cold and inedible. The women were also denied soap or towels, which meant that they were forced to spend their days in their own filth. In addition to these already terrible conditions, the women were also subjected to constant harassment from the prison guards. They were woken up in the middle of the night for roll calls and were beaten or otherwise physically abused if they didn't respond quickly enough. The guards also taunted them, calling them names and making lewd comments. Despite these horrific conditions, the women refused to give up. They continued to demand that their charges be dropped and that the government recognize their right to vote. Emmeline Pankhurst in particular was a thorn in the side of the prison administration. She was a fiery speaker and organizer, and she used her influence to keep the other prisoners' spirits up. She also wrote a number of letters from prison that detailed the horrific conditions the women were subjected to, as well as their ongoing fight for suffrage. These letters were smuggled out of the prison by fellow WSPU members and published in newspapers around the country, and they had an immediate impact. The British public was outraged by what they read about the treatment of these brave women who were simply fighting for their right to vote. Many people began to question whether the government had the right to treat its citizens so brutally, and the WSPU gained a lot of new supporters because of it. So how did these letters actually get out of prison? Well, it was a risky operation, but it was worth it. So Emmeline and the other WSPU members were able to smuggle their letters out of prison with the help of a fellow suffragette named Annie Kenny. Kenny would visit Emmeline and the others in prison, and they would pass her letters detailing their experiences inside. She would then take these letters and give them to the WSPU leadership, who would have them published in newspapers around the country. This was a risky operation, as the prison authorities were constantly searching for contraband, including letters. If anyone had been caught with one of Emmeline's letters, they could have been severely punished. But Kenny and the other WSPU members were willing to take the risk, because they knew that Emmeline's words were too powerful to be kept hidden. And they were right. The publication of Emmeline's letters caused an uproar in Britain. People were shocked to learn about the terrible conditions that women were subjected to in prison, and they began to question whether the government had the right to treat its citizens so brutally. This led to a surge in support for the WSPU and helped to turn the tide of public opinion in favor of women as suffrage. Eventually, the pressure became too much for the government to handle, and they agreed to meet with the WSPU leaders to discuss the possibility of granting women the right to vote. While this was not the end of the struggle for women's suffrage in Britain, it was an important first step, and it was all thanks to the courage of women like Emmeline Pankhurst and her fellow suffragettes, who were willing to stand up for what they believed in, no matter the cost. The fight for women's suffrage was a long and hard one, but thanks to the efforts of brave individuals like Emmeline and her fellow suffragettes, women in Britain finally won the right to vote in 1980. Emmeline herself lived to see this victory, although she died in 1928, just a few years before women were granted full equality under the law. Her legacy lives on today in the many women who continue to fight for gender equality around the world, and her story is a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon we have is our voices. If you enjoyed this video, check out more stories of inspiring women from history. Thanks for watching.